The morning sun shone through the windows of the Thompson mansion. Margaret Thompson stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her pearl necklace. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at her reflection. At 65, she still maintained the elegance that had made her one of New York's most respected socialites. But today, something was different. Something was wrong. Her son, Richard, burst into the room, his face red with anger. "Mother, have you seen what they're doing? They're trying to take everything from us." Margaret turned to face her youngest son. The TV in the corner was showing the news, another headline about the Thompson family scandal. Their company, Thompson Industries, was facing its biggest crisis in 50 years. "Your brother Thomas thinks he can just walk in and take control," Richard continued, pacing the room. "He's already convinced the board to consider his takeover proposal." Margaret sat down heavily in her favorite armchair. The feud between her sons had been brewing for years, but now it was threatening to tear apart not just the company but the entire family. "And that wife of his," Richard spat out the words, "Sandra's been seen meeting with our competitors. They're planning something." "Mother, I know it." Just then, Helen, the housekeeper who had been with the family for 30 years, entered with a tea tray. Her face showed concern as she caught the end of the conversation. "Mrs. Thompson, maybe you should rest," Helen suggested, pouring a cup of tea. "All this stress isn't good for your heart," but Margaret waved away her concern. "How can I rest when my family is falling apart? Thomas was always so much like his father, ambitious, determined. But lately he's changed. Ever since he married Sandra." Richard grabbed his phone as it buzzed. His face darkened as he read the message. "They've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. They're not even telling us what it's about." Margaret's hand shook as she lifted her teacup. "There's something else you need to know," she said quietly. "Something I should have told you both years ago." Richard stopped pacing and looked at his mother. Helen quietly tried to leave the room, but Margaret called her back. "Stay, Helen. You were there. You know the truth." Helen's face paled. "Mrs. Thompson, are you sure now is the right time?" "There will never be a right time," Margaret replied. She turned to Richard. "It's about your father's will, the real one." Richard sat down slowly. "What do you mean, the real one?" Margaret took a deep breath. 30 years ago, your father changed his will just before he died. Thomas doesn't know this, but he's not..." She paused, her voice breaking. "He's not actually first in line to inherit the company." Richard leaned forward. "What are you saying, Mother?" "There's another heir," Margaret whispered. "Your father had a daughter, before he married me. She never knew who her father was, but he made provisions for her in his will. She and her children are the true heirs to Thompson Industries." Richard stood up so quickly he knocked over his chair. "A sister? We have a sister. How could you keep this from us?" "To protect the family name," Margaret said. "Your father made me promise. But now, with everything that's happening..." She looked at Helen. "We need to find her. Her name is Rebecca Collins." Helen nodded. "I know where to start looking. I've kept track of her over the years, just in case." Just then, Thomas burst into the room. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fury on his face. "What are you all plotting in here?" Margaret's face went white. How much had he heard? Before anyone could respond, Sandra appeared behind Thomas. She was wearing a red dress that seemed too flashy for a morning at home, her blonde hair perfectly styled. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. My, Sandra said, looking around the room. "Quite the little family gathering. And Helen, how nice to see you involved in family matters." Helen straightened her back. "I was just serving tea, Mrs. Thompson." "Of course you were," Sandra replied sweetly. "Thomas, darling, we'll be late for our meeting." Thomas looked at his mother and brother suspiciously. "This isn't over. Whatever you're planning, remember who holds the power in this family now." After they left, Richard turned to his mother. "We need to find Rebecca before Thomas and Sandra destroy everything father built." Margaret nodded slowly. "Helen, get me that information. And Richard, we need a lawyer we can trust. Someone who won't be afraid to stand up to your brother." "I know just the person," Richard said. "Catherine Martinez. She used to work for father. Thomas fired her when he took over, but she knows every detail of the company's history." As Helen hurried out to make calls, Margaret looked at the family portrait hanging over the fireplace. Her late husband's eyes seemed to stare back at her, asking if she had made the right choice all those years ago. "I'm sorry, Charles," she whispered. "I should have told them sooner, but I promise you I'll make things right." Little did they know Sandra had lingered outside the door, hearing every word. She pulled out her phone and dialed quickly. "We have a problem," she said quietly. "A big one. Meet me at the usual place in an hour." The wheels were already turning, and the Thompson family's biggest scandal was about to explode. Lives would change, secrets would surface, and no one would emerge unscathed from the storm that was coming. Sandra's high heels clicked against the marble floor of the downtown cafe. She chose a secluded corner table where a man in a dark suit was already waiting. Jack Morrison, Thomas's right-hand man at Thompson Industries, looked nervous. "Did anyone follow you?" Sandra asked, sitting down. Jack shook his head. "No, but we need to be careful. If what you heard is true about this Rebecca Collins..." "It's true," Sandra cut him off. "I heard the old woman tell Richard everything. There's another heir, and if she shows up with proof, Thomas could lose everything." She leaned forward. "And if Thomas loses everything, we lose everything." Meanwhile, at Catherine Martinez's small law office, Richard paced back and forth while the lawyer reviewed old documents. Catherine pushed her reading glasses up her nose, her dark hair streaked with grey. At 50, she still had the sharp mind that had made her Charles Thompson's most trusted legal advisor. "These papers are interesting," Catherine said, spreading them on her desk. "Charles Thompson did make changes to his will just before he died, but those changes were never officially filed." Richard stopped pacing. "What does that mean?" "It means," Catherine explained, "that if we can find the original document and prove it's real, Thomas's claim to the company could be invalid. But we need Rebecca Collins to come forward." At that moment, Helen was in her small apartment, going through a box of old photographs. She pulled out one that showed a young woman with a baby. On the back was written Rebecca and Amy 1990. Helen picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Amy, this is Helen Watson. You probably don't remember me, but I used to visit you and your mother when you were very young. We need to talk. It's about your grandfather." Across town in the Thompson Industries boardroom, Thomas was in a heated discussion with the board members. "The company needs new direction," he insisted. "My father's old-fashioned ways are holding us back. The merger with Morrison Global is our best option." One of the older board members, George Parker, spoke up. "Charles Thompson built this company on trust and family values. This merger would mean laying off hundreds of loyal employees." "Times change," Thomas replied coldly. "If you don't like it, you're welcome to resign." Sandra entered the boardroom, walking straight to Thomas's side. She whispered something in his ear. His face darkened. "This meeting is adjourned," he announced, abruptly. "We'll continue tomorrow." After everyone left, Thomas turned to Sandra. "Are you sure about this, sister?" "Your mother was very clear," Sandra replied. "But don't worry. I have Jack looking into it. If this Rebecca Collins exists, we'll find her first." Back at the Thompson mansion, Margaret was looking through old photos in Charles's study. She found one of him standing with a young woman, Rebecca's mother. Tears filled her eyes as memories flooded back. Helen entered the study. "Mrs. Thompson, I found her. I found Amy." Margaret looked up. "Rebecca's daughter. Where is she?" "She's a teacher in Boston," Helen explained. She had no idea about any of this, but there's something else, something that could change everything. Before Helen could continue, they heard voices in the hallway. Thomas and Sandra had returned home. Margaret quickly hid the photos. "Mother," Thomas called out, "we need to talk about the company's future." Margaret straightened her back, gathering her strength. "Yes, we certainly do." In Boston, a young woman named Amy Collins sat in her small apartment staring at her phone. The strange call from Helen Watson had shaken her. She walked to her closet and pulled out an old box her mother had left her. Inside was a sealed envelope with instructions to open it only after her mother's death. Amy's hands trembled as she broke the seal. As she read the letter, her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered. Meanwhile, Jack Morrison met with a private investigator in a parking garage. Find everything you can about Rebecca Collins and her daughter Amy, he ordered. Thomas and Sandra. Want this handled quietly. And if I find them, the investigator asked. Don't approach them, Jack replied. Just report back to me. We need to know what we're dealing with before we make our move. Catherine Martinez was working late in her office when her phone rang. It was Richard. Catherine, Helen found her. Rebecca's daughter is in Boston. Don't call her yet, Catherine warned. We need to make sure all our evidence is solid. Thomas won't give up control without a fight. As night fell over New York, the various players in this family drama prepared for their next moves. Margaret sat in her study looking at the city lights. Helen brought her tea. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Margaret asked softly. Helen patted her hand. Your husband wanted the truth to come out eventually. He trusted you to know when the time was right. And if it tears the family apart? Mrs. Thompson, Helen said gently, I'm afraid the family is already torn apart. Maybe the truth is the only thing that can heal it. In their bedroom, Sandra made a late-night call while Thomas was in the shower. Everything's set, she whispered. Once we find this girl, make sure she understands what's at stake. Everyone has a price. But Sandra didn't know that Amy Collins was already reading her mother's letter, discovering the truth about her family and making plans of her own. The next few days would change the Thompson family forever, and no amount of money or power could stop what was coming. Amy Collins stood in front of her classroom in Boston, trying to focus on teaching her third-grade students. But her mind kept drifting to the letter she'd found. Her mother's words echoed in her head. Your grandfather was Charles Thompson, one of the richest men in New York. He never acknowledged us publicly, but he made sure we were taken care of. There's more you need to know, but you need to speak. With Helen Watson, she knows everything. After school, Amy sat in her car holding her phone. She'd already called in sick for the next few days. Finally, she dialed Helen's number. I'll be in New York tomorrow, Amy said firmly. I need to know the truth about my family. In the Thompson mansion, Richard was meeting with Catherine Martinez in the library. They spread documents across the large mahogany table. Look at this. Catherine pointed to a clause in an old contract. Charles Thompson set up a trust fund for Rebecca Collins. The payment stopped when she died 5 years ago, but they should have transferred to her daughter. Richard frowned. But Amy never received any money. Where did it go? That's what's interesting, Catherine said. Someone changed the trust fund details 2 years ago. All the money was redirected to a different account. Before she could continue, they heard footsteps. Sandra appeared in the doorway wearing an expensive red suit. Having a little meeting? Sandra's voice was sweet, but her eyes were cold. Thomas won't be happy to hear you're going behind his back with company business. This isn't company business. Richard stood up. This is family business. Isn't it all the same thing? Sandra smiled. She noticed Catherine. Well, if it isn't our former legal counsel, I thought Thomas made it clear you weren't welcome here anymore. Catherine gathered her papers calmly. Mrs. Thompson, I'm here as a guest of Richard and Mrs. Thompson. Unless you're now controlling who they can invite to their own home? Sandra's smile faltered slightly. As Catherine walked past her, Sandra grabbed her arm. Whatever you're planning, remember who has the power here. Power can change hands quickly, Catherine replied quietly, pulling her arm away. Meanwhile, Jack Morrison sat in his office at Thompson Industries, looking at the report his private investigator had sent. Amy Collins was clean. No scandals, no debts, nothing they could use against her. But there was something else, something about a safety deposit box her mother had kept. He picked up his phone to call Sandra, but Thomas walked in first. Any news about this supposed sister of mine? Thomas asked, loosening his tie. Jack hesitated. Nothing concrete yet, but what? Your father's old lawyer, Catherine Martinez, she's been seen at the mansion meeting with Richard and your mother. Thomas slammed his fist on the desk. They're plotting something. I want security cameras installed in every room of that house. I want to know everything they're doing. Is that legal? Jack asked nervously. I don't care if it's legal, Thomas shouted. I built this company into what it is today. I'm not going to let them destroy it with some fantasy about another heir. At that moment, Helen was picking up Amy from the airport. The young woman looked nothing like what Helen expected. She had her mother's dark hair and kind eyes, but there was something else. a determination that reminded her of Charles Thompson. "Before we go to the mansion," Helen said as they drove, "there's something you need to see." They pulled up to a small bank in downtown New York. Helen handed Amy a key. "Your mother left this for you. I've been keeping it safe until the right time." Inside the bank, Amy opened the safety deposit box. Her hands shook as she pulled out an old leather journal and a USB drive. "Your mother kept records of everything," Helen explained. "Every meeting with your grandfather, every promise he made. She knew this day might come." Back at the mansion, Margaret was confronted by Thomas in the sitting room. "Why is Catherine Martinez here?" he demanded. "What are you and Richard planning?" "We're trying to protect this family," Margaret replied. "Something you seem to have forgotten how to do." "Protect the family?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "By bringing in some stranger to claim part of our company?" "She's not a stranger," Margaret stood up. "She's your sister's daughter, your niece." "I don't have a sister." Thomas's face was red with anger. "Father would have told me." "Your father tried to protect everyone," Margaret said softly. "Maybe he was wrong. Maybe the truth would have been better from the start." Sandra listened to this exchange from the hallway, then quickly made a call. "Jack, we need to move fast. Get everything ready for the board meeting tomorrow. It's time to force their hand." In Boston, the private investigator broke into Amy's apartment. He searched everywhere until he found what he was looking for: old photos of Rebecca Collins with Charles Thompson. As he reached for them, a neighbor appeared in the doorway. "Hey, what are you doing?" The investigator ran, but not before the neighbor took a photo of him with her phone. At a small cafe near Central Park, Catherine met with George Parker from the board. "The merger Thomas is pushing through," George said. "It's not what it seems. Morrison Global is just a front. Once they have control, they're planning to break up the company and sell it off piece by piece." Catherine's eyes widened. "Do you have proof?" George slid a USB drive across the table. "Be careful with this. People have died for less." As night fell, Amy sat in a hotel room reading her mother's journal. Tears rolled down her face as she learned the full story of her family's past. Helen sat with her, offering silent support. "They think this is about money," Amy said finally. "But it's not. It's about the truth. It's about justice." Helen nodded. "Your grandfather wanted you to know everything when the time was right. I think that time is now." In their bedroom at the mansion, Sandra watched Thomas sleep. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jack. "Safety deposit box found, contents retrieved, moving to phase 2. Sandra smiled. Everything was falling into place, or so she thought. What she didn't know was that Catherine Martinez had already made copies of all the documents, and in Amy's hotel room, the young teacher was about to discover something in her mother's journal that would shake the Thompson family to its core. Amy's hands trembled as she read the last pages of her mother's journal. The hotel room was quiet, except for the sound of traffic outside. She looked up at Helen, her eyes wide with shock. "My mother wasn't just Charles Thompson's secret daughter," Amy whispered. "She was helping him investigate corruption in the company. She found evidence that someone was stealing millions of dollars." Helen sat down heavily in the chair beside her. "That's why she disappeared 5 years ago. We all thought she just wanted to get away from New York." "She didn't disappear." Amy's voice cracked. "According to this journal, she was getting close to exposing someone. The car accident that killed her, it wasn't an accident at all." At Thompson Industries, Thomas was in his office when Sandra burst in, her face pale. "We have a problem. The safety deposit box. It's not just documents. There's a recording." Before Thomas could respond, his secretary buzzed in. "Mr. Thompson, the SEC is here. They want to speak with you immediately." Thomas loosened his tie, feeling the walls closing in. "Sandra, get Jack up here now and call our lawyers." Meanwhile, Richard and Catherine were meeting with George Parker in a quiet restaurant. The older board member looked nervous as he spoke. "The merger with Morrison Global. It's all a front. The real plan is to strip the company's assets and move them offshore. Thomas and Sandra have been preparing this for months." Catherine pulled out her tablet. "Look at these transactions. Small amounts spread across different accounts, but they all lead back to one holding company in the Cayman Islands." Richard's phone buzzed. It was a text from Helen. "Need to meet." Amy found something big. Come to the hotel now. In the hotel lobby, Margaret arrived wearing dark sunglasses, even though it was evening. She hugged Amy tightly. You look so much like your mother. Rebecca was always kind, always looking for the good in people, even when she discovered the truth about the company. Before they could talk more, Jack Morrison appeared at the hotel entrance. Sandra had sent him to follow Margaret. Well, isn't this a touching family reunion? Jack said, walking toward them. But before he could reach them, two men in suits stepped in front of him. Mr. Morrison, FBI, we need you to come with us. At the mansion, Sandra was frantically shredding documents when her phone rang. It was her secret contact at Morrison Global. The deal's off, the voice said. Thomas is toxic now. The SEC is involved. Get out while you can. Sandra threw the phone across the room. Everything was falling apart. She ran to the safe behind the painting in Thomas's study. But when she opened it, the money and passports she'd hidden there were gone. In the hotel conference room, Amy played the recording from the USB drive for Richard, Catherine, and Margaret. It was a conversation between Thomas and Sandra from 5 years ago, planning Rebecca's murder. Margaret began to cry. How could he do this? He's my son. He's not the man you raised, Richard said gently. The company, the power, it changed him. Catherine was already on the phone with the district attorney's office. We have everything they need. Bank records, the recording, Rebecca's journal, it's over. But it wasn't over. Sandra had one last card to play. She called Thomas from the mansion. They know everything, she said. But I have a plan. Meet me at the private airfield in an hour. I have a plane ready. Thomas stared out his office window at the New York skyline. What about the money? Already transferred. We can start over somewhere else unless you want to stay and go to prison. While Thomas and Sandra plotted their escape, Amy was meeting with the Thompson Industries Board of Directors. She stood at the head of the table, her mother's journal in her hands. I'm not here to destroy this company, she said firmly. I'm here to save it, to return it to what my grandfather meant it to be. A business built on trust and family values. George Parker smiled. You sound just like Charles. He would be proud. At the private airfield, Thomas and Sandra arrived separately, but they weren't alone. FBI agents surrounded them before they could reach the plane. As they were led away in handcuffs, Sandra turned to Thomas. I never loved you, she said coldly. You were just a means to an end. Thomas didn't respond. He was watching his empire crumble, knowing he had destroyed everything his father had built. Back at the mansion, Margaret sat in Charles's study looking at old family photos. Helen brought her tea, just like she had done for 30 years. Maybe now we can be a real family, Margaret said softly. No more secrets, no more lies. Amy walked in, carrying a box of her mother's things. I found something else. Letters that my mother wrote to me, one for each birthday. She never sent them, but she kept them all. Margaret patted the seat next to her. Would you read them to me? I'd like to know more about my granddaughter. As Amy began to read, Richard stood in the doorway, watching his family begin to heal. The company would survive, stronger than before. The truth had finally come out, and with it the chance for a new beginning. In his jail cell, Thomas received a visitor, Catherine Martinez. Why are you here? He asked bitterly. To give you a chance to do one good thing, she replied. Tell us everything about the corruption in the company. Help us clean it up. It won't change what you did to Rebecca, but it might help you sleep at night. As she left, Thomas buried his face in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt something he had forgotten, shame. The sun was setting over New York, casting long shadows through the windows of the Thompson mansion. Amy stood in her grandfather's study, now her study, looking at his portrait. I'll make you proud, she whispered. Both of you. She meant her grandfather and her mother, two people who had fought for the truth until the very end. Now it was her turn to carry on their legacy, to lead the company into a new era of honesty and integrity. Helen watched from the doorway, smiling. Sometimes the truth took a long time to come out, but when it did, it had the power to change everything. The news of Thomas and Sandra's arrest was splashed across every newspaper in New York. Television crews camped outside the Thompson mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of Amy, the secret heiress who had brought down her corrupt uncle. Inside the mansion, life was slowly finding a new rhythm. Amy sat at the massive desk in what was now her office, reviewing company documents with Catherine Martinez. "The company's finances are worse than we thought," Catherine explained, pushing her glasses up. "Thomas and Sandra didn't just steal money, they made deals that put the whole company at risk." Amy rubbed her temples. How many people could lose their jobs? Without immediate action? Thousands. Margaret entered the office carrying a photo album. Despite everything that had happened, she visited Thomas in jail every week. "He's asking to see you," she said to Amy. Amy looked up from the papers. "I'm not ready." "He says he has information about your mother's accident," Margaret added quietly. "Information that wasn't in the recordings." Meanwhile, Richard was meeting with the board members. The company's stock had plummeted after Thomas's arrest, and investors were panicking. "We need to show them that Thompson Industries is still strong," Richard argued. "That we're more than just this scandal," George Parker spoke up. "What about the Morrison Global contracts? They're trying to back out of everything, even legitimate deals." "Let them," a voice said from the doorway. It was Amy. "We're going to rebuild this company the right way. No shortcuts, no backdoor deals." Across town in a women's prison, Sandra paced in her cell. Her lawyer had just delivered bad news. Thomas was considering a plea deal. He would testify against her in exchange for a lighter sentence. "Get me a phone," she demanded. "I need to make one call." Her lawyer shook his head. "Sandra, it's over. The evidence against you both is overwhelming." "It's not over until I say it's over," she hissed. Back at the mansion, Helen was helping Amy move into her mother's old room. As they unpacked boxes, Helen pulled out an old teddy bear. "Your mother kept this all these years," Helen said softly. "She used to tell me how she wanted to give it to you, but she was afraid it would lead you to ask questions about your family too soon." Amy hugged the bear, breathing in its musty scent. "Do you think she'd be proud of me, taking over the company?" "Oh, sweetheart," Helen sat beside her. "She was always proud of you. Even when she couldn't be with you, she watched from afar. Every school play, every graduation." Their moment was interrupted by Richard rushing in. "Amy, you need to see this. Sandra's lawyer just delivered a package to the DA's office. She had a backup plan." In the DA's office, Catherine Martinez reviewed the new evidence with growing concern. She immediately called Amy. "Sandra kept records of every illegal deal the company made for the past 10 years, Catherine explained. "Not just Thomas's crimes, everything. If this goes public, it won't just destroy Thomas and Sandra, it could destroy the whole company." Amy's hands gripped the phone tightly. "She's trying to force us to make a deal." "Yes, her freedom in exchange for keeping these records sealed." At the jail, Thomas sat in the visitor's room, waiting. When Amy finally walked in, he barely recognized her. She carried herself differently, now more confident, more like their father. "You wanted to tell me about my mother," Amy said, sitting down. Thomas looked older, his face gaunt. "Sandra ordered the hit, but I knew about it. I could have stopped it, but I didn't. Your mother, see Rebecca, and she tried to warn me about Sandra. Said she had proof that Sandra was working with our competitors even back then." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Sandra's going to destroy everything," Thomas replied. "She doesn't care about the company or the family, she never did. But I did, even if I lost my way." Meanwhile, Margaret was in the family cemetery, standing at Charles's grave. Richard found her there. "Mother, what are we going to do about Sandra's evidence?" Margaret turned to face her son. "What would your father do?" "Face it head on," Richard answered. "Tell the truth before someone else does." Back at the office, Amy called an emergency board meeting. The room was tense as she stood to speak. "Sandra thinks she can blackmail us with the company's past sins," she began, "but we're not going to play her game. Tomorrow morning, we're going to announce a full internal investigation. We'll reveal everything ourselves, face the consequences, and then rebuild." George Parker stood up. "The stock will crash. We could lose everything." "Maybe," Amy agreed, "but we'll keep our integrity. And that's what this company was built on in the first place." In her prison cell, Sandra received the news of Amy's decision with rage. She ripped up the plea agreement her lawyer had brought. "They think they've won," she snarled. "But I still have one more card to play." What Sandra didn't know was that Helen had been going through Rebecca's old things and had found something else, evidence that Sandra had been involved in criminal activities long before she met Thomas. Activities that had nothing to do with Thompson Industries. Helen made a call to Catherine. "I found something that changes everything." As night fell over New York, Amy stood at her office window, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow the company would face its darkest hour, but for the first time since this all began, she felt at peace with her decisions. Richard joined her at the window. "You know, you remind me of Father. He always said that the truth might hurt but lies destroy." "We'll survive this," Amy said firmly, "and we'll be stronger for it." What they didn't know was that across town, in a small apartment, a young reporter was about to discover a connection between Sandra and a decades-old unsolved murder. The Thompson family saga was far from over. Jenny Martinez, a young reporter for the New York Daily News, stared at her computer screen in disbelief. She'd been investigating Sandra Thompson's past for weeks, and finally, she'd found something big. Before Sandra married Thomas, she'd been connected to the mysterious disappearance of a wealthy businessman in Miami. Jenny picked up her phone and dialed her editor. "Tim, I found something about Sandra Thompson, something that happened 15 years ago in Florida." At Thompson Industries, Amy was dealing with the fallout from their public announcement. The stock had dropped 30%, and investors were demanding answers. She sat in the boardroom facing angry shareholders. "Yes, the company made mistakes," Amy said firmly, "but we're facing them honestly. That's more important than stock prices." An elderly investor stood up. "My family has held Thompson stock for 3 generations. How do we know there aren't more secrets?" Before Amy could answer, Richard rushed into the room. "Amy, you need to see this now." In the hallway, Richard showed her his tablet. It was an email from Sandra's lawyer. "She's willing to tell us everything about Mother's accident." Amy's face went pale. "What accident? Grandmother Margaret is fine." "Not Margaret," Richard said quietly. "Your mother's accident. Sandra says she wasn't working alone that day." Meanwhile, Helen was in the mansion's attic, going through more of Rebecca's belongings. She found a locked metal box behind some old trunks. Using the key she'd kept all these years, she opened it. Inside was a USB drive labeled Insurance and a letter addressed to "My dear Amy." Helen's hands shook as she read the letter. "Oh, Rebecca," she whispered. "You knew this would happen." At the prison, Thomas received another visitor, George Parker. "Why are you here?" Thomas asked. "Because Sandra contacted me," George replied. "She says you ordered the hit on Rebecca, that she has proof." Thomas leaned forward. "She's lying. I told you I knew about it but didn't stop it. Sandra ordered it herself." "Then why did you transfer $2 million to an offshore account the day before Rebecca died?" Thomas's face went white. "I never made that transfer." Across town, Catherine Martinez was meeting with Jenny Martinez, her niece. "What exactly did you find about Sandra?" Catherine asked. Jenny pulled out her notes. 15 years ago, a businessman named Robert Carson disappeared in Miami. His body was never found. But the last person to see him alive was a woman named Sandra Mitchell, Sandra Thompson's real name. Does Amy know about this? Not yet, but there's more. Carson was investigating a series of fraudulent companies that match the pattern Sandra used at Thompson Industries. Back at the mansion, Margaret sat in the garden with Amy, sharing tea like they did every afternoon now. "Your grandfather loved this garden," Margaret said. "He would sit here for hours, thinking about the future, about the kind of legacy he wanted to leave." Amy watched a butterfly land on a nearby flower. "Did you ever suspect about Thomas and Sandra?" Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. There were signs, small things at first. The way Sandra would ask about the company's finances, how Thomas began to change after their marriage. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't want to believe it," Margaret admitted. "Sometimes we blind ourselves to the truth because the truth is too painful." Their conversation was interrupted by Helen rushing out to the garden. "Amy, you need to see what I found. It's from your mother." In Amy's office, they watched as Helen connected the USB drive to a computer. The screen filled with documents, photographs, and video files. Your mother didn't just find evidence of corruption, Helen explained. She found evidence of murder. Sandra's first murder. Meanwhile, Sandra sat in her prison cell writing in a small notebook. Her cellmate watched curiously. "What are you writing?" Sandra smiled coldly. "My memoirs. The true story of the Thompson family. Every dirty secret, every lie, every crime. By the time I'm done, there won't be anything left of their precious reputation." What Sandra didn't know was that her cellmate was an undercover FBI agent, placed there to monitor her every move. At the DA's office, Catherine received an urgent call from the FBI. "Mrs. Martinez, we have a situation. Sandra Thompson is trying to arrange a hit from inside prison." Catherine's blood ran cold. "On who?" "Amy Collins." Richard was driving home when his phone rang. It was George Parker. "I just left your brother," George said. "Richard, something's not adding up about that money transfer. The account numbers, they match accounts that Sandra controlled before she even met Thomas. Are you saying she framed him for Rebecca's murder?" "I'm saying this goes deeper than any of us realized." Back at the mansion, Amy finished reading her mother's letter. Tears streamed down her face. She knew, Amy whispered, she knew Sandra would try to destroy the company. That's why she kept all this evidence, to protect us when the time came. Helen put her arm around Amy's shoulders. "Your mother was always thinking ahead, always trying to protect you." Just then, Margaret burst into the room. "Amy, turn on the news now." On the TV screen, Jenny Martinez stood in front of Thompson Industries, delivering a breaking news report. Sources have revealed that Sandra Thompson, currently in custody for corporate fraud and murder, may be connected to the disappearance of Miami businessman Robert Carson 15 years ago. This revelation raises new questions about the series. Have events that led to the current crisis at Thompson Industries. Amy turned to Catherine, who had just arrived. "How much danger are we in?" Catherine's face was grim. "Sandra's desperate, and desperate people are the most dangerous." As night fell over New York, the pieces of a deadly puzzle were finally coming together. But would they solve it in time to prevent another tragedy? The FBI office buzzed with activity as Agent Sarah Cooper reviewed the surveillance footage from Sandra's prison cell. She'd been undercover as Sandra's cellmate for 2 weeks, and what she'd uncovered was disturbing. "She's made contact with someone on the outside," Sarah reported to her supervisor. During kitchen duty, she passed a note to one of the delivery workers. Meanwhile, at Thompson Industries, Amy sat in an emergency meeting with the security team. The head of security, Mike Davidson, looked worried. "We've increased patrols around the building and the mansion," he explained. "But Sandra has connections we don't know about. People who owe her favors." Richard paced nervously. "What about Amy's apartment? Is it safe?" "No place is completely safe right now," Mike replied. "That's why we're recommending she move back to the mansion temporarily. It's easier to protect." Catherine Martinez burst into the room, clutching her phone. "We have another problem. Jenny's story about Robert Carson? Someone broke into her apartment last night. They took all her research." Across town, Jenny Martinez sat in her editor's office, shaken but determined. "They didn't get everything," she said. "I kept copies in a safe place, and I found something else, a connection between Carson's murder and someone inside Thompson Industries, someone who's still there." At the prison, Thomas received the news about the break-in at Jenny's apartment. His hands shook as he asked for paper and a pen. He began writing frantically. "Dear Amy, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you sooner. The night your mother died, I wasn't just covering for Sandra, I was covering for someone else too. Someone who's still close to you." In the mansion's library, Helen and Margaret sorted through more of Rebecca's belongings. Helen pulled out an old photo album. "Look at this," Helen said, pointing to a photo. "This was taken at the company Christmas party 15 years ago. See who's in the background?" Margaret squinted at the image. Her face went pale. That's Sandra, but she's standing next to George Parker. Thomas didn't meet her until years later." "They knew each other," Helen whispered. "All this time, they knew each other." At his downtown apartment, George Parker poured himself a drink with shaking hands. His phone kept buzzing with messages from an unknown number. Finally, he answered. "Stop calling me," he hissed. "You know what needs to be done. a woman's voice replied. It wasn't Sandra. If Amy digs any deeper, we all go down. In her prison. Sandra smiled as she watched the news report about Jenny's break-in. Her cellmate, Agent Cooper, pretended to read a magazine while listening carefully. Shame about that reporter's apartment, Sandra said casually, but people should learn to mind their own business. Is that what happened to Carson? Sarah asked carefully. He didn't mind his own business? Sandra's eyes narrowed. You ask a lot of questions. Back at Thompson Industries, Amy reviewed the company's old security footage with Richard. They were looking for any sign of Sandra and George Parker together before she officially joined the company. Stop, Amy said suddenly. Go back. That meeting from 2010. Richard rewound the footage. There it was, George Parker letting Sandra into the building through a side entrance late at night. He helped her infiltrate the company, Richard realized. He helped her get close to Thomas. Catherine arrived with more news. The FBI found the delivery worker who took Sandra's note, but he claims he already passed it to someone else, a woman. What woman? Amy asked. Before Catherine could answer, the power in the building went out. Emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows. Mike Davidson's voice crackled over the radio. Security breach in the parking garage, multiple intruders. In the prison, Agent Cooper watched as Sandra began laughing quietly to herself. Right. On schedule, Sandra whispered. At the mansion, Helen was about to show Margaret another old photograph when she noticed a red dot moving across the wall, a laser sight from a sniper rifle. Get down! Helen screamed, pulling Margaret to the floor just as a bullet shattered the window. Jenny Martinez was driving to meet her source when a black SUV started following her. Her phone rang. It was Catherine. Jenny, listen to me. Catherine said urgently. Get to the FBI office now. Don't stop for anyone. In the Thompson Industries parking garage, Amy, Richard, and Catherine huddled behind a concrete pillar as footsteps echoed around them. The safe room, Richard whispered. We need to get Amy to the safe room. No, Amy said firmly. I'm tired of running. It's time we face this. Mike Davidson's voice came through their earpieces. Multiple shooters in the building. They're not just here to scare you. This is a hit team. At the prison, Agent Cooper finally had enough evidence. She pressed the panic button hidden in her watch. Sandra Thompson, she announced as guards rushed in. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. Sandra just kept smiling. You're too late. Everything's already in motion. In the parking garage, Amy heard a familiar voice call out, Amy, it's George. Don't shoot. I can explain everything. Richard grabbed Amy's arm. Don't trust him. But Amy had already spotted something in the security camera feed on her phone. George wasn't alone. Behind him, hidden in the shadows, was a figure she recognized from her mother's old photos. That's impossible, she whispered. She's supposed to be dead. The emergency lights flickered again, plunging the garage into darkness. When they came back on seconds later, Amy found herself face to face with the truth, and it was more shocking than anything she could have imagined. Standing before her was Robert Carson's wife, the woman everyone thought had died of grief 15 years ago. The woman who had been pulling Sandra's strings all along. Hello, Amy, she said softly. I've been waiting a very long time for this moment. Above them, police sirens wailed in the distance. But would help arrive in time? Elizabeth Carson stood in the dim light of the parking garage, her expensive suit, a stark contrast to the concrete surroundings. 15 years had changed her, but her eyes still held the same cold determination they had when she was Robert Carson's grieving widow. You look confused, Amy, Elizabeth said, taking a step forward. Wondering how the grieving widow of a murdered businessman ended up here. It's quite a story. Richard moved to stand between them, but Elizabeth's associates already had their weapons trained on him. You were behind everything, Amy said, the pieces finally falling into place. You used Sandra to get to Thomas. Elizabeth smiled. Sandra was easy to manipulate, so hungry for power, so eager to prove herself. All I had to do was point her in the right direction. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Helen and Margaret huddled in the panic room as security teams swept the grounds for the shooter. We need to warn. Amy? Margaret said, trying to dial her phone. Elizabeth Carson, I remember her now. She came to a company party once, years ago. Charles was horrified when he saw her. Helen's eyes widened. Because he knew what her husband had been investigating? No, Margaret whispered, because she was supposed to be dead even then. At the prison, Agent Cooper interrogated Sandra, who had finally started talking. You don't understand, Sandra laughed. Elizabeth didn't just want revenge, she wanted the whole Thompson empire. Robert was investigating Charles Thompson's dealings with offshore companies when he disappeared. But those companies were legitimate, Agent Cooper said. Were they? Sandra raised an eyebrow. Or was that just what Charles wanted everyone to believe? In the parking garage, Elizabeth circled Amy like a predator. Your grandfather was very clever, Elizabeth continued. He built his empire on secrets and lies. Robert was getting too close to the truth, so Charles had him killed. That's not true, Amy protested. My grandfather was a good man. A good man, Elizabeth laughed. He destroyed my family. Made it look like Robert had embezzled money and fled the country. I lost everything. George Parker stepped forward. Tell her the rest, Elizabeth. Tell her what really happened to Rebecca. Elizabeth's face hardened. Rebecca was just like her father, too noble, too determined to expose the truth. She found evidence that would have revealed everything, not just about Robert's murder, but about Charles's entire operation. At the FBI office, Jenny Martinez was connecting the final dots with Catherine. Look at these company records, Jenny pointed to her screen. The offshore companies Charles Thompson set up. They were all managed by the same law firm in the Cayman Islands, a firm owned by Elizabeth Carson's father. Catherine's face went pale. She wasn't investigating the companies, she was protecting them. Back in the garage, police sirens grew louder. Elizabeth checked her watch. We don't have much time, she said. So let me make this simple. Sign over control of Thompson Industries to me, and you get to live. Refuse, and well, she gestured to her armed associates. Why not just kill me like you killed my mother? Amy asked, her voice steady despite her fear. Elizabeth's smile faltered slightly. Your mother's death was unfortunate. She wouldn't listen to reason. No, George Parker interrupted. Tell her the truth. Tell her why Rebecca really had to die. Elizabeth spun around, pointing her gun at George. Be careful, old man. You're not as valuable as you used to be. Rebecca found proof, George continued, ignoring the gun. Not just about Robert Carson's murder, but about who Elizabeth really was. She wasn't Robert's grieving widow. She was Charles Thompson's daughter from his first marriage. Amy felt the world spin around her. What? That's right, Elizabeth's voice shook with rage. Charles Thompson was my father. He abandoned my mother before I was born, started a new family, built an empire. Everything that should have been mine went to you and Thomas instead. In the prison, Sandra was still talking to Agent Cooper. Elizabeth planned everything. She used me to get to Thomas to take control of the company. But she made one mistake. She trusted me to keep her secrets. At that moment, FBI teams were surrounding Thompson Industries. Agent Cooper's voice crackled over their radio. Target is Elizabeth Carson. She's Charles Thompson's illegitimate daughter. Consider her armed and extremely dangerous. In the garage, Amy took a step toward Elizabeth, her half-aunt. You're part of this family, Amy said softly. Why destroy it? Family, Elizabeth laughed bitterly. Charles Thompson threw my mother away like garbage. She died alone while he built his perfect new life. Everything he built should have been mine. Suddenly, the garage lights flared to full brightness. FBI teams poured in from every entrance. Elizabeth Carson, a voice boomed over a megaphone. We have the building surrounded. Elizabeth's associates began to lower their weapons, but Elizabeth herself remained focused on Amy. It's not over, she said, her finger tightening on the trigger. I've waited too long for this. Drop the gun, Elizabeth. George Parker's voice was firm. Charles knew about you. He tried to find you to make things right. Those offshore companies? They were set up in your name. Everything was meant for you. Elizabeth's hand began to shake. You're lying. Check your father's office, George said. Behind the painting of the New York skyline, there's a letter waiting for you, has been for 20 years. For a moment, the garage was completely silent. Then Elizabeth slowly lowered her gun, tears streaming down her face. As FBI agents moved in to make the arrest, Amy turned to George. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Because I promised Charles I'd... Protect both his daughters, George replied sadly. I failed with Elizabeth. I couldn't fail with Rebecca, too. Outside, the sun was rising over New York. Another day was beginning, but for the Thompson family, nothing would ever be the same. The truth about Charles Thompson's past had finally come to light, but at what cost? And what other secrets still lurked in the shadows of the Thompson empire? The morning sun streamed through the windows of Charles Thompson's office as Amy opened the safe behind the painting. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a thick envelope addressed to Elizabeth Carson. Margaret stood beside her, tears in her eyes. All these years I never knew. Charles carried so many secrets. They weren't alone. FBI agents were still sweeping the building, and Agent Cooper stood nearby, watching carefully. We need that letter as evidence, she reminded them gently. Amy nodded, breaking the seal. As she read, her face softened. He loved her. He spent years trying to find her and her mother. The companies, the money, it was all for Elizabeth. At the police station, Elizabeth sat in an interrogation room, her elegant suit wrinkled, her makeup smeared with tears. Catherine Martinez entered with the letter. Your father wrote this 20 years ago, Catherine said, sliding it across the table. Read it. Elizabeth's hands shook as she unfolded the pages. Her cold facade crumbled as she read Charles's words. Of regret, of love, of desperate attempts to make amends. Meanwhile, in the prison infirmary, Sandra received an unexpected visitor. Thomas. How did you get in here? She demanded. I made a deal, Thomas replied. Full confession about everything, including what really happened the night Rebecca died. Sandra's face went pale. You wouldn't dare. I already did. The DA has everything. You, Elizabeth, the overseas accounts, and everything. Back at Thompson Industries, Richard was meeting with the board members. The room was tense with uncertainty. The company's reputation is in shambles, one member said. The stock has hit rock bottom. How do we come back from this? Amy walked in, her head held high. By telling the truth, all of it, no more secrets, no more lies. George Parker stood up. I have something to add to that truth. Charles Thompson left one final gift for the company, a trust fund hidden from everyone. Enough money to save everything he built. At the mansion, Helen found Margaret in the garden looking at old photos. Charles tried to do the right thing in the end, Margaret said softly. He just didn't know how. Helen sat beside her. Sometimes the hardest thing is admitting our mistakes, even to ourselves. In her cell, Elizabeth read the letter for the 10th time. Tears fell on the paper as she reached the final page. My dearest daughter, Charles had written, by the time you read this, I may be gone. My greatest regret is not finding you sooner, not being the father you deserved. The empire I built was meant to be your legacy too. I can only hope that someday you'll understand that everything I did was out of love. Jenny Martinez sat at her desk, putting the finishing touches on her story. But it wasn't the scandal piece she'd originally planned. Instead, it was a story of family, redemption, and the power of truth. In the hospital, a doctor checked Thomas's vital signs. The stress of the past few weeks had taken its toll. You need rest, the doctor insisted. Not yet, Thomas replied. There's one more thing I need to do. Across town, Amy visited Rebecca's grave. She placed fresh flowers and sat on the grass. You tried to protect everyone, Mum, she said softly. Even Elizabeth, you knew she was family, didn't you? That's why you kept investigating, even when it put you in danger. Richard found her there an hour later. The FBI finished searching Elizabeth's house. They found decades of evidence, records of every deal, every secret. She was obsessed with the family. Can you blame her? Amy asked. All she wanted was to belong. At the police station, Elizabeth made a decision. She asked for a lawyer, then began to talk. She revealed everything, not just about Sandra and the recent crimes, but about decades of corporate intrigue. I wanted revenge, she told Agent Cooper. But Charles, he wanted reconciliation. I was too blind to see it. Margaret received the news in Charles's study. She picked up his photograph, touching it gently. You tried, my love, she whispered. In your own way, you tried to make things right. Helen entered with tea, just as she had done for 30 years. But this time, she also carried a small box. "I found this in Rebecca's things," she said. "It's addressed to Elizabeth." Inside was a locket containing a photo of Charles and Elizabeth's mother on their wedding day. With it was a note in Rebecca's handwriting. "For my sister, when the time is right." Amy called an emergency press conference. The media packed the room, hungry for more scandal. But what they got was something else entirely. "The Thompson family has a complicated history," Amy began, "full of mistakes, regrets, and missed opportunities. But it's also a story of love, redemption, and second chances." She announced the creation of the Charles Thompson Foundation, dedicated to helping broken families heal. The first beneficiary would be a women's shelter in Miami, where Elizabeth's mother had spent her final years. In her cell, Elizabeth watched the press conference on TV. For the first time in years, she felt something other than anger. She felt hope. Thomas, watching from his hospital bed, made a call to his lawyer. "I want to change my plea. I need to tell the whole truth." As night fell over New York, the Thompson mansion lights glowed warmly. Inside, Amy sat with Margaret, Richard, and Helen, looking through old family albums. "Family isn't just about blood," Margaret said, looking at a photo of Charles. "It's about forgiveness, about choosing to love even when it's hard." Amy touched the photo of her mother, then the newly discovered photo of Elizabeth as a child. "We're all connected," she said softly. "Maybe that's what Mom and Grandfather were trying to tell us all along." The scandal that had threatened to destroy the Thompson family had instead revealed its deepest truths. But as Amy would soon discover, there was one final secret yet to be revealed, one that would change everything they thought they knew about Charles Thompson's legacy. 1 month after Elizabeth's arrest, the Thompson mansion was quieter than usual. Amy sat in Charles's study, reading through old company documents. The morning light caught the silver frame of a new family photo on the desk, one that now included a picture of Elizabeth and her mother alongside the other family portraits. The door opened, and Catherine Martinez walked in carrying a thick folder. "You need to see this," Catherine said, her voice serious. "We found it in one of the offshore accounts Elizabeth managed." Amy opened the folder and gasped. Inside were documents showing that Charles Thompson had set up a network of charitable foundations around the world, all operating in secret. "He was helping people," Amy whispered. "All those years we thought he was hiding money. He was building something bigger than just a company," Catherine nodded. "The foundations help families torn apart by poverty, addiction, abuse. Elizabeth was supposed to run them." At the prison, Thomas received news about his plea deal. His lawyer looked pleased. "With your cooperation in exposing the full extent of Sandra and Elizabeth's crimes, they're offering a reduced sentence. 5 years instead of 20. Thomas stared out the window. "What about Elizabeth? She's negotiating her own deal. Her testimony about Sandra's past crimes is invaluable." Meanwhile, Sandra faced the consequences of her actions in a maximum security facility. Her cellmate now was a tough-looking woman who had no patience for Sandra's schemes. "Guess your fancy friends can't help you in here," the woman sneered. Sandra just stared at the wall, her empire of lies finally crumbled to dust. At Thompson Industries, Richard supervised the implementation of new transparency policies. The stock price was slowly recovering as investors gained confidence in the company's new direction. George Parker walked into Richard's office, carrying an old leather briefcase. "Found this in the archives," he said. "It's Charles's personal journal, the last entry. Well, you should read it yourself." Richard opened the journal to the final page. The handwriting was shaky, written just days before Charles's death. "My time is running short. Elizabeth, Rebecca, Thomas, Richard, my children, all of them. I failed them in different ways, but perhaps it's not too late. The foundations are my true legacy, not buildings or stocks, but hope. Second chances, the things I never gave Elizabeth and her mother. Amy will understand. She has her mother's heart and her grandfather's vision. The future of the Thompson name is safe in her hands." Across town, Margaret visited Elizabeth in the detention center where she awaited trial. "I brought you something," Margaret said, sliding a small album across the table. "Photos of your mother and Charles from before. He never stopped loving her." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she opened the album. "I wasted so many years on anger," she whispered. "It's never too late to start again," Margaret replied. Charles believed that. That's why he created the foundations. Back at the mansion, Helen found Amy in the garden, sitting on the bench where Charles used to spend his mornings. "Your mother would be proud," Helen said. "Not just of how you saved the company, but of how you're healing the family." Amy smiled, through tears. "I understand grandfather better now. He wasn't perfect, but he tried to make things right." Jenny Martinez's article about the Thompson family was published in the Sunday edition. Instead of a scandal expose, it was a story of redemption. The final paragraph read, "The Thompson legacy isn't found in stock prices or corporate mergers. It's in the quiet work of charitable foundations across the globe, in the healing of broken families, and in the truth that it's never too late to right the wrongs of the past." That evening, Amy called a family dinner at the mansion. Margaret sat at one end of the table, Richard at the other. Through a special arrangement, Elizabeth was allowed to attend under guard. Even Thomas was permitted to come from the prison hospital, wearing an ankle monitor. Helen served the meal just as she had done for decades, but this time she was invited to sit with the family. "Before we begin," Amy said, standing, "I want to share something. The foundations grandfather created, they're just the beginning. I've decided to expand them, create a new division of Thompson Industries dedicated to family reunification and support." Elizabeth looked up from her plate. That was his dream, to help other families avoid our mistakes. "And I want you to help run it," Amy continued. "Once you've served your time, the Thompson legacy should be about healing, not hate." Thomas spoke up, his voice humble. "I'd like to help too, if you'll let me." Margaret watched her family, broken, healing, but finally honest with each other. Charles would have been proud. Later that night, Amy stood in Charles's study, looking at the family photos on the wall. There was space for new ones now. Space for a family that included all of Charles's children and their stories. The phone rang. It was Agent Cooper. "Miss Collins, we found something else in Elizabeth's records, something about your mother's research. She was working on one last project before she died, something big." Amy's heart raced. "What kind of project?" "We don't know yet. But whatever it was, it scared Sandra enough to order the hit. The files are encrypted, but our team is working on them." As Amy hung up the phone, she looked out at the New York skyline. The Thompson story wasn't over. It was just beginning a new chapter. In her cell, Sandra stared at the ceiling, remembering a conversation with Rebecca just days before her death. "I know what you're hiding," Rebecca had said, "and someday, everyone else will know too." Sandra closed her eyes, knowing that someday had finally arrived. The sun set over New York, casting long shadows through the mansion windows. The Thompson family had survived its greatest crisis, but more challenges lay ahead. Yet this time they would face them together, bound not just by blood and secrets, but by truth and love. Amy touched the locket containing photos of both her mother and Elizabeth's mother. "The past doesn't have to define us," she whispered, remembering her mother's words. "It's what we do with today that matters." In the garden, the roses Charles had planted decades ago bloomed under the evening sky, their beauty a testament to the fact that from the deepest roots, new life could always grow. The me. Thompson's saga would continue, but the foundations of lies had been replaced with something stronger, the foundations of truth.